Thousands of feet underground, miners trusted their lives to a machine they could not see. So how did mine hoists lift men and tons of ore safely back to the surface? To understand that, we have to go back to the moment mines began digging deeper than human muscle could handle.
At the beginning of the 20th century, a miner working thousands of feet underground could finish his shift, step into a steel cage, and close the gate behind him. Then the floor moved. Above him, somewhere he could not see, a massive engine began winding steel rope onto a drum. The cage accelerated upward through a shaft barely wider than the conveyance itself. There was no staircase beside it, no second route home. For the next few minutes, dozens of men were suspended over darkness by machinery operating far above their heads. Then the cage reached the surface. The miners stepped out, and almost immediately it went back down carrying timber, drills, replacement parts, or another shift of workers. A few minutes later, it might rise again loaded with tons of ore. This machine was called a mine hoist, and once American mines descended far enough underground, nearly everything depended on it. Because finding ore was only half the problem. The deeper question was, how do you move an entire industrial operation thousands of feet straight up and down without losing control? Early mines did not need enormous hoisting engines. Miners followed exposed deposits, dug shallow shafts, or drove tunnels directly into hillsides. Men could climb ladders, while buckets lifted small amounts of ore to the surface. Then the mines followed the mineral veins downward. Copper, iron, silver, lead, gold. Every additional 100 feet created more transportation. Workers had to descend farther before they could begin mining. Timber, drills, pipe, explosives, and machinery had to travel down. Ore and waste rock had to travel up. At shallow depths, a hand-operated windlass might work. Later, horses could walk in circles around a mechanism called a whim, winding rope onto a drum. But animal power had an obvious limit. A deep mine might produce hundreds or thousands of tons of material every day. If that material could not reach the surface fast enough, it did not matter how quickly miners broke the rock underground. The shaft had become the mine's most important transportation route. Essentially, engineers had to build a railroad, except this railroad went straight down. Steam power changed what was possible. Instead of asking men or horses to wind the rope, mining companies installed stationary steam engines near the shaft. The concept appeared simple. A steam engine turned a large drum. Steel rope wrapped around that drum. The rope passed over a wheel at the top of the head frame and dropped into the shaft. At the other end hung a cage or an ore container. Turn the drum one way and the load rose. Reverse it and the load descended. But deeper mines made this simple system enormous. The rope itself could weigh tons. The cage could carry workers or heavy equipment. The engine had to accelerate all that mass without jerking it violently, then bring it to a precise stop hundreds or thousands of feet away. And lifting was only part of the challenge. A descending loaded cage pulled downward with tremendous force. The hoist had to control that energy rather than simply produce power. That meant enormous brakes became just as important as enormous engines. A mine hoist was not designed merely to lift. It was designed to never lose control of what gravity wanted to take back. Follow the rope from the machine. It began at the winding drum inside the hoist house. From there, it traveled upward toward the head frame, the tall structure standing above the shaft. At the top, the rope passed over a large wheel called a sheave. Then it plunged underground. Attached below might be a cage, essentially a mining elevator used for people and equipment. Or it could be a skip, a large container designed specifically for ore. When the hoist operator opened the controls, the engine rotated the drum and shortened the length of rope hanging in the shaft. The conveyance rose. But some systems used two conveyances at once. As one descended, another rose. The weight moving downward helped offset part of the weight being lifted upward, making the system more efficient. That allowed the shaft to develop a rhythm. A cage could carry miners down. A skip could bring ore up. Another load could already be waiting below. Every cycle had to happen quickly because the shaft was a bottleneck. You could add more miners underground. You could install faster drills. You could blast more rock. But all of that production eventually reached the same narrow vertical opening. If the hoist could not keep up, the entire mine could not keep up. There was one obvious problem. The hoist operator could not see the cage. It might be half a mile beneath him. Yet, he had to stop it accurately at underground levels he could not see. Large hoists solved this with depth indicators. The indicator was mechanically connected to the winding machinery. As the drum turned and rope moved, a pointer traveled across a scale corresponding to the cage's position in the shaft. The operator watched that indicator almost like a locomotive engineer watching the track ahead, except his train was moving vertically somewhere underground. Signals came from the shaft using bell codes. Different combinations could mean raise, lower, stop, men aboard, move to a particular level. The system required precision because one of the most dangerous possibilities was an overwind, pulling the cage beyond its intended stopping point toward the headframe. This was not a theoretical risk. On May 14, 1893, at the Red Jacket shaft in Calumet, Michigan, less than 100 miles from where Quincy's own hoists were running, a cage overwound, and 10 men were killed. Accidents like it were the reason engineers came to treat the brake as being just as important as the engine. So mines added layers of protection: powerful brakes, overspeed devices, and emergency stops. Automatic systems built to intervene the instant a conveyance traveled too far. The hoist operator controlled a machine he could see, but the lives and loads he was actually moving existed mostly as a pointer, a bell signal, and tension in thousands of feet of rope.
Few places show the scale of this technology better than Michigan's copper country.
As mines followed copper deposits deeper underground, their hoisting systems had to grow with them. By 1920, Quincy Mine's main shaft ran nearly 9,300 feet into the earth. To keep pace, the company ordered what was, at the time, the largest steam hoisting engine in the world, a machine that cost $160,000, delayed 2 years by the First World War before it finally started running. It developed 2,500 horsepower and wound rope onto a drum 30 feet across. Loaded with 10 tons of copper rock, a skip could ride that rope to the surface at 36 miles an hour. The building around it needed its own foundation. 32,000 cubic yards of reinforced concrete, poured just to keep the machine from shaking itself apart. The machine existed because depth was destroying productivity. Imagine adding another 1,000 feet to a mine. That does not only make the journey longer, every worker now spends more time traveling. Every skip of ore takes longer to reach the surface. Every replacement drill or timber takes longer to arrive underground. The hoist therefore determined how much of a deep ore body could actually be exploited economically. A faster, more powerful hoist did not simply improve one piece of equipment. It increased the productive capacity of everything below it. Deep mines quickly developed specialized conveyances. The cage was built for flexibility. It carried miners, tools, timber, machinery, and sometimes small mine cars. The skip was built for speed. Ore entered from a loading pocket underground. The skip shot toward the surface, reached the dumping station, discharged its contents, and returned for another load. That separation increased production, but it also created one of the strangest daily transitions in mining. For much of the shift, the hoist was part of an ore handling system. Then the shift ended. Hundreds of men wanted to come home. Suddenly, vertical transport became a scheduling problem. A cage could carry only so many workers. Every stop took time. Every loading cycle delayed the next group waiting underground. The hoist therefore influenced the working day itself, and whenever people entered the cage, the priorities changed immediately. Ore demanded speed. Human passengers demanded smooth acceleration, precise stopping, reliable signals, and brakes capable of holding the entire load. The same machine had to provide both. The enormous steam engine was visually impressive, but the actual connection between the surface and the mine was the rope. Steel wire rope had to support the cage, the payload, and increasingly, its own enormous weight. Every trip bent that rope around drums and sheaves, again and again, thousands of times. Wear could develop from abrasion, corrosion, broken wires, fatigue, or repeated bending. So inspection became critical. Mining crews examined ropes, watched high-stress areas near attachments, tracked service life, and replaced components before deterioration became dangerous. And depth introduced an engineering paradox. To go deeper, you needed more rope. More rope meant more weight. More weight meant the hoist had to spend more of its capacity simply lifting the rope itself. Eventually, engineers were not only asking, how heavy a cage can we lift? They were asking, how much steel can we afford to hang down the shaft before the rope becomes part of the problem? Deep mining was beginning to run into the physics of its own lifeline. Homestake Mine in Lead, South Dakota, pushed that problem about as far as any American mine ever did. By the time it closed in 2002, its shafts reached 8,000 feet down, deeper than any other gold mine in the Western Hemisphere. Moving men and rock through that much shaft meant running enormous Nordberg hoists, built by the same company behind Quincy's giant engine, on shafts named Ross and Yates. Those hoists are still running today, though they now lower physicists instead of miners, because the cavern's homestake left behind became an underground physics laboratory. Steam hoists were enormously capable, but they demanded an entire support system. Boilers needed fuel, water had to be supplied, pressure had to be raised before work began. Valves, pipes, cylinders, and mechanical controls required maintenance. Electric motors offered a better solution. As mines electrified, electric hoists became increasingly common. They could start faster, reverse precisely, and integrate more easily with automatic controls. The technology of the hoist itself also changed. Traditional drum hoists stored rope by winding it onto large drums. Another system, the friction hoist, often associated with Friedrich Kupp, used friction between the rope and a powered wheel to move the conveyances. This became especially valuable in deep shafts because engineers no longer needed to store enormous lengths of rope on increasingly gigantic drums in the same way. Modern mine hoists now use sophisticated electric drives and computerized control systems. Sensors now track speed, position, load, braking, and motor performance, layered with redundant safety systems the steam era never had. Yet the purpose remains almost unchanged from the steam era. Send workers and equipment down, bring ore up. Repeat the cycle thousands of times, without ever forgetting what is hanging beneath the machine. When people imagine deep mining, they usually picture what happened below. dark tunnels, drilling machines, rock faces, ore cars, miners working far from daylight. But none of that could function independently of the surface. A deep mine was an underground industrial world connected to everything above by a remarkably small number of shafts. The hoisting engine controlled those connections. It determined how quickly workers reached the face, how rapidly equipment moved underground, how much ore reached the surface, and ultimately, how deep mining could remain economically practical. Today, old hoist houses still stand beside abandoned shafts across historic mining districts. Some contain enormous drums that have not moved in decades. The rope is gone, the cages are gone, the miners are gone. But the machinery tells you something the empty shaft cannot. The drills found the ore. The explosives broke it. The miners loaded it. But the machine that made deep mining possible was often the one that never went underground at all.